The moment Dr. Harlow Sinclair walked into the fundraising gala, the room shifted. Not loudly, not all at once. It was the kind of shift that happens in places where people have learned to be polite about their cruelty, a slight lean away, a gaze that moves a half-second too quickly, a conversation that suddenly finds a more interesting direction. I noticed it because I was standing near the entrance, checking the placement of the floral arrangements for the third time that evening, trying to look useful so my supervisor wouldn't find me another task that involved a clipboard and zero human interaction. I was 26 years old, and 4 months into my job as a volunteer coordinator for the Pemberton Health Foundation in Ottawa. It wasn't glamorous. I'd taken it because my older brother's accident the previous winter had left our family in a financial situation I didn't have a clean word for, and the foundation offered a small stipend on top of what I could earn doing weekend shifts at a coffee shop on Elgin Street. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that year. The gala was held at the Shaw Centre, overlooking the Ottawa River. The foundation raised money for pediatric rehabilitation programs across Eastern Ontario, and every November it pulled together the kind of crowd that made me acutely aware of how my rented suit fit across the shoulders. Surgeons, senators, CEOs of pharmaceutical companies, the kind of people who ordered wine by the bottle and knew which fork to use without glancing at the table. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Dr. Harlow Sinclair walked through the door alone. She was the kind of woman people might have described as striking, if they were being honest instead of polite. Tall, composed, wearing a deep burgundy dress that made her look exactly as serious as her reputation suggested, but the right side of her face, and I say this only because it matters to what happened next, bore a network of burn scars that ran from her temple down to her jaw, pale and textured against her dark brown skin. She carried herself the way people do when they have spent years deciding not to apologize for existing. I found out later that Harlow was one of the top pediatric reconstructive surgeons in the country, that she had trained at the University of Toronto, done her fellowship at Sick Kids, and now ran a specialized program at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario that gave free surgeries to kids from low-income families who couldn't access the care they needed through regular wait times. She was, in any room she entered, the most accomplished person in it. But what I saw in that first moment wasn't her credentials. What I saw was that nobody moved to greet her. I watched a man in a tuxedo. I later learned he chaired the foundation's board, make direct eye contact with her and then very deliberately turn back to his conversation. I watched 2 women near the bar glance at her and then look away in that careful, studied way that is somehow worse than staring. I watched Harlow stand just inside the entrance and take a slow breath. It wasn't a breath of nerves. It was a breath of recognition. Like she had walked into this particular room 100 times before and knew exactly what came next. My job that evening was to make sure the event ran smoothly. Check in with the caterers, confirm the silent auction tables were properly labeled, make sure the AV system didn't have a repeat of last year's feedback disaster during the keynote address. My supervisor, Gwen Ashford, had been very clear about what my job was not: mingling, socializing, or making myself visible to donors in any way that might embarrass the organization. I crossed the room anyway. Every step felt like walking against a current. I was aware of exactly how this looked. A junior nobody in a rented suit walking toward one of the most recognizable surgeons in Canadian pediatrics at an event where I was supposed to be invisible. I was aware that Gwen was probably watching from somewhere near the bar. I was aware that I had no plan, no script, no good reason to be doing what I was doing except that I could not stand there and watch someone be made to feel like they didn't belong in a room they'd probably helped fund. When she reached Harlow, I introduced myself with my full name, which I immediately felt was unnecessary and slightly formal, and told her I was with the volunteer coordination team. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, measured, like she was calculating the odds of what came next. I asked if she'd like a glass of water while she got settled. She said yes. That was how it started. We stood near the window for about 10 minutes before the welcome remarks began. I learned she was from Sudbury originally, a detail that surprised me because I was from Chelmsford, just outside, and we spent a few minutes doing that thing people from Northern Ontario do when they meet each other in the South, which is establish mutual geography with the seriousness of a peace treaty. She asked how I'd ended up at the foundation. I gave her the shorter version of the truth. My brother, the accident, the gap year that had stretched past a year, She didn't offer the polished condolences that people usually reach for. She just nodded and said that made sense. Then Gwen appeared at my elbow and steered me away with the kind of smile that means exactly the opposite of a smile, and I spent the next 40 minutes rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. Harlow gave the keynote that evening. I hadn't known she was the keynote speaker. She stood at the podium without notes and talked about a girl she'd operated on earlier that year, a 9-year-old from Iqaluit who had been waiting 4 years for a procedure that should have taken 4 months. She talked about what those years do to a child. Not the physical waiting, but the social waiting. The way other kids learn to look at difference before adults teach them not to. She paused in the middle of the speech and touched the side of her own face, briefly, just once, and said she had learned about that particular kind of waiting first. The room was quiet in a way. Rooms rarely are when they're full of people. After the applause, I found her standing near the silent auction tables, studying a framed painting someone had donated. I brought her a coffee. She'd mentioned offhandedly that she hadn't eaten since noon, and a small plate of the cheese and crackers that were technically for guests and not for event staff. She looked at the plate, then at me. "You're going to get in trouble," she said. "Probably," I said. She ate the crackers. We talked for another 20 minutes. She asked questions that were direct without being rude, the kind of questions that make you feel like the person is actually listening, instead of waiting for their turn. She asked what I actually wanted to do, not what I was doing for money. I told her I'd studied health sciences at Carleton with the vague intention of going into hospital administration, that I'd been good at the organizational side of things, that I was still trying to figure out what that meant in practice. She said that was honest. I said I was trying. At the end of the evening, as people were collecting their coats, she found me near the exit. She said she appreciated the company. I told her it was nothing. She said, and I have turned this over in my mind more times than I can count, she said that it wasn't nothing to her, and that she wouldn't forget the kindness. Then she handed me her card and said that if I was ever interested in something more structured than rearranging centerpieces, I should call. I told myself I wouldn't call. That felt presumptuous. That felt like I was reading too much into a polite exchange at a charity event with a woman who was probably home by 10 o'clock and had already forgotten my name. I called 3 weeks later. What I didn't know when I made that call was that the evening at the Shaw Center had set something in motion that went well beyond my own small circumstances. I didn't know that Harlow had gone home that night and, for the first time in 18 months, called her father in Sudbury. I know this because she told me, much later. I didn't know that she had spent the better part of 2 years reducing her public presence after a series of articles that had dissected her appearance in ways that had nothing to do with her work. Articles written by people who seemed to believe that the most interesting thing about a woman who gave reconstructive surgery to children who couldn't afford it was the fact that her face was scarred. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew I had a card in my wallet and a number to call. The foundation's administrative director, a man named Bernard Olay, was the one who answered. Harlow had mentioned my name, apparently. He was professional and slightly bemused and asked me to come in the following Tuesday. I put on my better shirt and took the 85 bus to the hospital and sat in a waiting room for 20 minutes before being led into a small office filled with the particular organized chaos of someone who runs too many programs at once. The position wasn't glamorous. It was a coordination role for Harlow's pro bono surgery program, managing wait lists, liaising with referring physicians in rural and northern communities, coordinating travel logistics for families who had to come to Ottawa from places like Timmins or Yellowknife or Happy Valley Goose Bay. It paid better than the stipend. It was not the job I had imagined when I'd pictured my career during those optimistic third-year lectures at Carleton. It was, I understood within about a week, exactly the kind of work I was suited for. The first 3 months were steep. The program had grown faster than its infrastructure, which meant there were families waiting on calls that hadn't been made, referrals sitting in inboxes that hadn't been checked, and a filing system that appeared to have been organized by someone who had then immediately left the country. I worked through most of my lunch breaks and several evenings. Gwen from the foundation, who had initially been frosty about the manner in which I'd left her event team, eventually sent me a text that said simply, "You landed well. Good for you." I chose to interpret this generously. Harlow was in the workplace, almost a different person from the woman I'd met at the gala. Not colder, that's the wrong word. more efficient, precise. She moved through the hospital the way people do when they have learned to use time as a resource rather than an experience. She didn't waste words. She expected the same from everyone around her, which I appreciated because I find excessive pleasantries exhausting. We communicated mostly by email in those early months, and occasionally by a rapid-fire exchange in the hallway outside her office that she conducted while reading a chart, and I conducted while trying to keep pace with her considerably longer stride. But there were other moments, quiet ones. A Thursday afternoon when she stopped by my desk and asked, out of nowhere, whether I'd heard about the proposed cuts to the provincial health transfer and what I thought it would mean for the waitlist numbers. I gave her my honest analysis, which was partly informed by research and partly informed by panic. She listened, added 2 points I hadn't considered, and then told me to put it in writing so she could take it to the board. I stayed until 7:30 that night drafting a brief that I was not at all sure was good enough. She sent back one comment the next morning. "This is exactly what we needed. Thank you." I kept that email. What I was learning slowly was the shape of what Harlow had survived. Not the fire, that story was public record. The details available to anyone who searched her name, which enough people had done that she'd learned to expect it. She had been 28 and in her second year of residency when the accident happened. A kitchen fire at her apartment building in Toronto. She'd gotten out. 2 neighbors hadn't. She'd spent 3 months in hospital and returned to her residency 9 months after that because she had not spent her entire adult life training to be a surgeon only to stop being one. She had finished her residency and her fellowship and built a career that by any measure was extraordinary. What was less public was the slow erosion that had happened after. The articles I mentioned. The conferences where she noticed that certain invitations had stopped arriving. The colleagues who spoke to her with a particular careful gentleness that she found more exhausting than hostility, because at least hostility was honest. The way she had begun, incrementally, to contract her world into the places where her work spoke clearly enough that her face became irrelevant. The hospital, the operating room, her apartment in Westboro with the good light and the stacks of journals she actually read. She told me some of this in pieces, over months, in the way that people reveal things when they have learned to be careful about revelation. I told her some things too, about my brother Joel. I can use his real name here because he's given me permission, and because he's proud of how this story ends, in a way he wasn't for a long time. About the accident on the 401 that had left him with a spinal injury that the doctors in the early weeks had described with a caution that meant they weren't sure what to promise. About the year of rehabilitation and the way our family had reorganized itself around the new geography of his life, and what that had done to my mother's savings, and my father's sleep, and my own sense of what it meant to plan for a future when futures had proven to be less reliable than I'd thought. Joel was doing better by then. He'd moved back into his own apartment in Barhaven. He'd started a podcast about adaptive sports that had, improbably, found a real audience. He was, in ways I hadn't expected, more himself than he'd been before the accident, as if the process of rebuilding had shaken loose something essential that the ordinary machinery of life had been obscuring. But the financial weight of that year had not fully lifted, and I was still sending home a portion of my paycheck every month, which was fine, which I wanted to do, but which also meant that certain conversations about my own future, savings, stability, the things you're supposed to be building in your mid-20s, existed mostly in the abstract. The first time Joel met Harlow was at the Foundation's spring reception, about 7 months after I'd started the coordination role. He came in his chair, which he uses sometimes and not others, depending on the day and the distance and about 40 other factors that he has stopped explaining to people who ask. He and Harlow ended up in conversation near the appetizer table for almost half an hour. I could see them from across the room. Joel doing the animated thing he does when he's interested in someone, hands moving, leaning forward, Harlow doing the thing I'd come to recognize as her version of engaged, which was very still and very focused and occasionally accompanied by a small, precise smile. Later, Joel texted me, "She's the real deal. Also, I think she genuinely likes you, man. Like, actually likes you. Don't be slow about it." I didn't know what to do with that. I put the phone down and went back to the logistics spreadsheet I was working on. The setbacks came, because they always do, and because the world doesn't reorganize itself politely around the moments when things are going well. In the fall of my first full year at the program, A journalist published a profile of Harlow in a national magazine. It was by the standards of the genre, a positive piece. It talked about her work and her patients and her outcomes data, which were genuinely remarkable. But the article opened with a physical description of her scars that was long and detailed, and framed with the kind of language that presents itself as neutral while performing something else entirely. The writer used the word haunting twice, the word striking 4 times, the word remarkable only when preceded by "it is remarkable that she has achieved." Harlow read it. Of course she read it. I know because she came into the office the next morning 40 minutes later than usual, which she never was, and spent the first half of the day in her office with the door closed, which she also never did. I left a coffee outside the door around 11 and knocked once and didn't say anything. At noon, she opened the door and looked at the coffee, which was cold by then, and drank it anyway. That evening, I was still at my desk when she stopped on her way out. She stood in the doorway for a moment and said that she was tired of having to be extraordinary just to be allowed to be present. I said I thought that was a sentence that deserved to be written down somewhere, because it was true and it was exactly right, and I was angry on her behalf in a way that I was trying not to show, because she hadn't asked for my anger and it wasn't what she'd need from me. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "You don't look away." I said I didn't know what she meant. She said, "Yes, you do." That was in October. In December, at the Foundation's year-end reception, held again at the Shaw Center, the same room, 1 year on, she arrived and the room did not shift the same way it had the year before. Or maybe it did, and it just mattered less this time. Or maybe I was watching her differently. She walked in and crossed the room and found me near the same window, and we stood there again. And the Ottawa River was dark beyond the glass, and the lights of Gatineau reflected off the water in long, cold lines. She said, "1 year." I said, "1 year." She said she had been thinking about expanding the program, a partnership with a hospital in Winnipeg, potentially Thunder Bay. She wanted my honest read on whether the coordination infrastructure could handle it. I gave her my honest read, which was that it could handle it if we hired 1 more person and rebuilt the referral tracking system, and that I had already been drafting a proposal those lines, because I'd seen the conversations she'd been having with the board, and I thought it was coming. She looked at me with an expression I'd gotten better at reading by then. "You drafted a proposal," she said. "Just an outline," I said. "You drafted a proposal," she said again differently. I sent it to her that night from my phone on the bus home. She replied at 11:15 with 4 words, "This is very good." I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone in my pocket and looked out the window at the city going past and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The expansion happened. Not quickly. Nothing in hospitals administration happens quickly, which is something you have to make peace with early or it will hollow you out, but it happened. By the following spring, the program had a formal partnership agreement with the Health Sciences Center in Winnipeg, and we were deep in negotiations with a children's center in Thunder Bay. The waitlist in Northern Ontario had dropped by 40%, which sounds like a number and is also, if you think about it too hard, a child who didn't spend 4 extra years waiting, a family that got a phone call, a kid who didn't have to explain themselves to every new classroom for another year longer than necessary. Harlow presented the outcomes data at a national conference in Vancouver in April. I know because I watched the live stream from my desk in Ottawa and then closed my laptop and felt something I didn't have an immediate word for, which I eventually identified as pride. Not the kind you for yourself, the other kind. She called me that evening from the hotel. It was the first time we'd spoken on the phone rather than by email, which I noted with the part of my brain that catalogs such things. She said the presentation had gone well. I said I'd watched. She was quiet for a moment, then she said she'd been thinking about something she wanted to say when she got back. I said, "Okay." She said, "Don't overthink it." I said, "I'm not." I absolutely was. She got back on a Thursday. I was at the office Friday morning 20 minutes earlier than usual, which I told myself was coincidence. She arrived at her usual time, came to my desk, stood there for a moment with her coat still on, and said, "I think we should have dinner." "Not for work." I said, "I think so too." We went to a small Italian place on Preston Street that she liked for reasons she explained involved the pasta being actually salted properly, which turned out to be a longer explanation than I expected, and which I found completely endearing. We sat there for 3 hours. We talked about Joel and his podcast. which had just been picked up by a sports network. We talked about her father's retirement and the house in Sudbury, where she'd grown up, which backed onto a lake, and which she visited every summer without fail. We talked about the funding gap in the new Winnipeg partnership, and whether the provincial government's position was going to shift before the fiscal year, and what our contingency looked like if it didn't. At some point she laughed at something I said. Really laughed, the kind that catches people off guard. And the restaurant was warm and the pasta was in fact properly salted, and the Ottawa night was doing that thing in April where it can't quite decide whether it's still winter, and the lights on Preston Street were blurred slightly by the coal in the glass. And I thought, this is the kind of evening I want to remember for a long time. I told her that. She looked at me. Good, she said. Me too. The year after that, Harlow gave the keynote at the same annual gala where we had first met. This time the foundation had asked her months in advance and sent a car and listed her name at the top of the program in the kind of type that made it clear she was the reason people were coming. She stood at the same podium in the same room, and this time she brought visual aids, photographs and outcome charts, and a video message from a 12-year-old in Sioux Lookout, who had received a procedure through the program and who described in the unvarnished language of a 12-year-old what it was like to walk back into school and not have to answer questions every single day. The room was very quiet when the video ended, the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence. Afterward, when the speeches were done and the crowd had softened into smaller conversations, she found me near the window overlooking the river. The same window, the same view. She stood beside me and we looked out at the water for a moment without saying anything, which is the kind of silence you can only have with someone you've spent enough time with. That silence has stopped being uncomfortable. She said, "Do you remember what I told you the first time we were here?" I said, "That you wouldn't forget the kindness." She said, "I meant it." I looked at her. I know. She was quiet for another moment. The lights of Gatineau lay across the water in long, pale lines. Somewhere behind us, someone laughed at something, and the sound rippled through the room and dissolved. I had stopped coming to these things, she said. I had stopped walking into rooms where I knew how people were going to look at me. I had gotten very good at making my world smaller and calling it peace. She turned and looked at me then directly, the way she does when she's saying something she's thought through carefully. "You gave me the room back," she said. "Not just that room, all of them." I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not someone who handles those moments gracefully. I tend to deflect or undercut them because they feel too large to hold without doing something awkward. But that night I didn't do either of those things. I just stayed where I was and let it land. Because here is what I had learned in the 2 years since I'd crossed that ballroom in a rented suit with no plan and a supervisor who was definitely watching, and approximately zero idea what I was doing. The moments that freshen most are almost never the ones you prepared for. They're the ones where you looked around at what was happening and couldn't find a reason not to act, where you chose a small inconvenient kindness over the much easier option of minding your business and keeping your head down. I had not changed Harlow's life. That's not what this is. She had built her own life with her own extraordinary hands and a precision and persistence that I admired more the longer I knew her. What I had done was show up once at a gala with a glass of water and some cheese crackers and the entirely selfish impulse to not watch someone stand alone in a room full of people. And then again. And then again. She once told me that courage was something she associated with emergency rooms and operating theaters and the particular clarity that comes when everything is at stake and there is no time to think. I told her I thought there was another kind, the unglamorous kind. The kind that happens in rooms full of people where the stakes aren't life or death, but they're still real. Where you cross the room when nobody else does. Where you knock on a door and leave a coffee. Where you draft a proposal because you saw it coming, and you wanted to be useful, and you believed quietly and without certainty that you were in the right place. Joel called it just being decent. He said it in that way he has, the way that sounds like an understatement and isn't. Maybe that's all it ever is. The Shaw Center was full that evening. The silent auction raised more than any previous year. 3 new donors signed on to support the northern expansion. Outside, the Ottawa River was doing what it does in November, moving dark and cold under a sky that couldn't make up its mind, very Canadian, very indifferent to the small human dramas happening in the lit building on its bank. And inside, near a window on the second floor, A woman who had spent 2 years making her world smaller was standing in a crowded room choosing not to. I think about that sometimes. Not the grand moments, but the small geometry of how things change. One glass of water. One conversation that runs longer than it was supposed to. One decision to stay at the table instead of making your excuses. Harlow told me she wouldn't forget the kindness. I will never forget what happened when she decided to walk back into the room.